We need to look through the microscope of what to do right now to survive. And I think for a lot of organizations that are not close to Washington, DC, there's still a hope that maybe the money is going to come back, that maybe policies will change, that perhaps things will go back to some degree to the way they were. And I unfortunately don't think that's the case.
Welcome back, everybody. Rich Brubaker, founder of Collective Responsibility, here today with another episode of the Sustainable Ambassador Podcast. Through this podcast, I'm speaking with global professionals in nonprofit, for-profit, academic, other spaces about the work they're doing against the challenges they see in their community, their economy, their environment. In this episode, I'm extremely honored to be joined by Blair Glencorse, who is the founder and co-CEO of the Accountability Lab, which makes governance work for people around the world. Most recently, he and his team conducted a survey of more than 800 organizations around the world that have been impacted by the recent USAID freeze to better understand the impacts, both immediate and long-term, of those stop orders. And so for me, this is going to be a really great episode. It's very timely, and I'm looking forward to it. So, Blair, thank you very much for taking the time to join us.
Thanks, Rich. Great to be with you.
All right, so as a starting point, would you mind introducing yourself and a little about the work of the Accountability Lab?
Thanks, Rich. My name's Blair. I'm co-CEO of Accountability Lab. We are a network of local labs all around the world that support better governance and accountability of people in power. And we do a variety of different things. We run campaigns, we build communities, we support knowledge and training for civil society organizations. And recently we've been doing a lot of work around the aid cuts in terms of collecting data and supporting organizations to respond. We ourselves were recipients of USAID money. And so when the stop work orders came in, and those now in most cases have turned into cancellations of USAID money, we began to rapidly collect data, as you mentioned, from civil society organizations globally to try and understand what the impact was. The point being, of course, that we can't make decisions about what to do collectively if we don't have the data.
You were impacted by this. You saw the need to kind of measure what was going on. Just before we get into the information, what was the process that you saw, that others saw, as this came out? I mean, as an outsider, we saw press conferences, we saw a list of fraud, waste, and other. But from the organization's standpoint, like, what did you see? What did you receive? And what was that process for the first, say, week or whatever, when you're thinking, like, is this a real pause or is this going to turn into a termination?
So we received letters initially saying that our work was suspended. There then was a waiting period until at some point later we did receive letters saying most of those grants had been terminated. The challenge has been working out how to do that, what costs are covered, how to work with the US government to recoup money for work that had already been completed. And even now, 3 months later, we still, to some extent, don't know the liabilities we have, because of course the orders came down and said you must suspend your work immediately as of this date. But that's impossible to do with ongoing projects. You have local labor laws in terms of what you need to pay staff for salaries. You have office costs, rent, everything else that you can't just pause at a day's notice. So there's a lot of costs actually that, ironically, given that this is framed as a cost-cutting exercise by the US government, actually are going to end up costing that government a lot of money. So we're in that position. There are thousands of other organizations that are in the same position, and all of that has generated a level of uncertainty and an inability to make operational decisions, which has been really challenging.
But in the middle of this, you made the decision to start this research process. So I'm curious, why go through that when you're already fighting probably a 3-alarm blaze? And what were you hoping to achieve or learn through the research itself?
So when this happened, it was almost second nature to kind of jump into action and think, what can we do for our community? How can we understand what's happening? How can we use that information to inform decision making? So we didn't really think twice. And because many of our projects were suspended, we had staff on team who didn't really have anything to do. So we've redeployed a lot of them to this work. And the idea is to collect data rapidly. So it's not representative. It isn't enough data to make really, really concrete decisions, but it's iterative, it's indicative, and it allows us to see where trends might point and where organizations might go. So the point of collecting the data so quickly to begin with was in that way to try and help all of us just get a sense of where things might go wrong, what the broad impact is on our fields, and then to begin to inform some decision making going forwards.
But what were some of the questions that you're asking through this research, like more specifically, and what were some of the key takeaways that you guys came out with so far?
One of the key things we wanted to know was what the financial runway was for civil society organizations globally, to know if there's a cliff coming up over which many of those organizations might fall, and at which point big chunks of the civic ecosystem might begin to collapse in different places, which I think is precipitated by the USAID cuts, but is exacerbated by other aid cuts around the world, including in the UK and a lot of Europe. The direction of aid funding has been going downwards for a while, and this is really another nail in the coffin. So what we found was both for-profit organizations in the development space, but also non-profit civic organizations, more than 50% had less than 6 months of financial runway left. And this was almost 3 months ago now. We're actually conducting another survey right now to see where we are. So it's a very tenuous financial situation for many organizations. Because it's not just organizations that receive US money directly. There are subcontractors, there are partners, there are other organizations that build their work around the US aid ecosystem that are in deep trouble currently. This is a massive change to the way that we understand the viability and sustainability of nonprofit organizations.
More than half of them had less than 6 months. That would indicate a really high reliance on US aid. And so how reliant were they, not just for the runway, but like as part of, say, percentage of budget or percentage of staff allocated towards those projects?
There were about 40%, I think, of the organizations surveyed had more than 3/4 of their budget removed from this. So they were highly reliant on US government money. Another 25% had 50% plus of their budget funded by the US government. So yes, there was a massive amount of dependency, and we can maybe get into the problems around that and the difficulties of the system as it was. And the other point to make here is that while other organizations might be funded by other donors, US money in many cases was what was called full cost recovery on grants, which means some of it could be used to cover organizational overheads in ways that other donors do not allow. And in terms of area of work that has been most affected, global health is definitely a big one. I'm sure people have seen headlines about that. Humanitarian work is a big sector that's been affected. Work on gender, work on human rights, media, and governance, which is more of our fields, are some of the big sectors that we see that have been most affected.
Regionally, did you find any uniqueness? Like, was it kind of, Southeast Asia, South America? Was there any difference, or did they all kind of equally get shellacked, as it were?
We tend to have better networks in Asia and Africa. So a lot of the organizations we heard with are in those regions. I mean, if you look at some of the countries that were most dependent on US government money, a lot of them were in Africa, Liberia, for example, Kenya. Those are the sorts of places that have been really hard hit and perhaps don't have as much money from some other donors. There's more research that's come out recently, actually, from an organization called ID Insights that has looked in a slightly longer term way, both at the money that was lost by certain countries, but also their ability to perhaps raise money from elsewhere, their ability to pivot, and so it's slightly longer term looking data, and all of the worst hit countries in that analysis are in Africa. So unfortunately, as usual, it's the places that are least able to handle these sorts of things that are hardest hit.
They're hardest hit. What are the responses you're seeing so far to this loss of financial stability, in a sense? Like, are they cutting people loose? Are they cutting programs? Have they already successfully found ways to fill the buckets back up? Like, what are you seeing so far?
Great question. I think it's all of those things. There have been huge amounts of layoffs. That's another question we asked in our survey. 70% of organizations have laid off staff. Another quarter were considering it a few months ago. I suspect they followed through. We, unfortunately, at the Accountability Lab have had to do similar things. We have, yes, closed down programs. Other organizations have done the same. It's obvious that consolidation now needs to happen. So we've set up a facility to allow that to happen. But it's not just mergers or partnerships, it's also divestment of assets, it's handover of projects, it's even sunsetting of organizations at this point. We're even talking to a few organizations about how they might hand over some of their work to governments at the local level, which I think is really interesting. In some ways, it's opened up conversations and opportunities that were not there previously, although it is extremely difficult at the moment for people involved in all of this.
And are you seeing at this point new donors stepping in to fill in the gap, or do you think it's a little bit too early to tell? Because, UBS and all these catalytic philanthropists keep talking about looking for the right deals. I feel like with this pullout, there's an opportunity here for donors to step in a little bit further. Do you find like that's happening yet, or is it still a little bit too early to tell?
I don't think it's happening, sadly. Government donors are not able to fill these gaps. The US was just too big of a donor. The amount of money is too difficult to replace. And as we mentioned, a lot of donors in the global north were already cutting budgets, and even since the USAID cuts, some countries have also cut aid budgets. The UK is a good example. There are a couple of small European donors, the Irish, the Spanish, the Danish, I think, that are maintaining aid levels, but in relative terms, it's still small. On the philanthropic side, there are now foundations stepping up. Some of your watchers and listeners may have been following some of that conversation. There's a big push in the US to increase payout rates. Some big foundations are doing that, which is excellent, but it's still never going to be enough to fill the gaps. There is at the same time a big push, which again was perhaps overdue, for organizations to find more sustainable revenue streams, which is fine, I think, and makes complete sense. We're doing the same. But I do worry for organizations that work on more political issues or advocacy or human rights or those sorts of issues that don't lend themselves quite as much to earned income, that there are going to be pieces of the ecosystem that just don't get the support that they need. And that could be really problematic going forwards.
Yeah, and I guess for those who are watching, listening, I did a bit of research. Germany's pulled back, UK pulled back, Netherlands is pulling back, obviously the US, Canada, and there's a few others that I'm missing. UK, they made the last announcement. But to your point, like I haven't seen anyone in Asia really step in, although I'm kind of hopeful that family offices will see this as their opportunity. Within the region, I think that this is probably an opportunity for regionally specific high net worth brands, like say from VinFast from Vietnam or Thai Union from Bangkok, or like leading brands that actually also come in here. But one question I have is, and I've talked to a few people about how USAID works. I would love your perspective on how the grants themselves from the financials work, because my understanding was the vast majority, and I've heard up to 80% sometimes, of the money is actually spent on kind of American equipment, American experts who are involved in these projects. Only like between 20 and 30% may go to the ultimate organization. So is that true? And if so, then how much money are we really talking about needs to be filled in? Because it would seem like if that was actually a real representation of the global, like the actual situation, then that 40 million, it's like 32 billion is lost and 8 billion is like the hole we need to fix. And I'm just curious, like, can you give some context for that? Because you've got more experience in this, and I'm curious, like, what you've been hearing from others. Like, was it really a huge loss, or is it just that we need 8 billion to come in?
It's a great question, and there's been a conversation for a long time, as many of your listeners and watchers will know, about localization of aid, and precisely the point that you're making, that so much of American aid, but also aid from other countries, is actually spent in America, because it's contracted to American organizations who then subcontract and so on, and there's a chain. And by the time that money gets to a local organization in the place that the work is done, perhaps 20% of the money remains. So it was an inefficient system. There's no question. I think most people would suggest that it needed to be changed. The challenge again is just how quickly and how shambolically the changes happened, which has left people in a lot of trouble. So there are better and different ways of doing things. I think there's a lot of conversation now around mutual aid, around community support, around more proximate giving circles, finding ways to shift systems to make sure that more money gets to local entities who know the answers to problems, who are better positioned to solve. So yes, the same amount of money may not be needed, but I don't want that to sound like a suggestion that governments shouldn't step up and continue to fund important life-saving work, because they should. It should just be done more efficiently and with local partners who know what they're doing. So it's a complex issue. There are lots of dynamics related to international aid that we need to think about as we try and rethink or redesign the system. But making sure that it is driven by people in specific contexts who know how to deal with the challenges is really important.
Yeah, and actually, I was gonna kind of ask that question now because I feel like when they say waste, fraud, and abuse, it's a really easy way to get a lot of people who don't understand the system to kind of back this current policy. Now, I think we can agree there's some inefficiency there for sure. The policies may not match, say, with like DEI. Like Biden had a really, like, that was a huge emphasis for him. It's not going to be for Trump. So, hey, it's not fraud, it's not abuse, it's a policy difference. But I'm more interested in like the efficiency side of this. Like, okay, they're going to reform this on some level. Like the State Department is going to take over some of this, all of this responsibility. If you were to kind of maybe look back, like what are two or three things they could do as they take on this responsibility to make sure that the money spent has a higher level of impact? And again, like I'm not saying it's abuse or it's fraud at all. Like I know the number of layers that exist there, but maybe the efficiency part, like how could we maybe make the impact more efficient by taking out US organizations? Like, is there a way to effectively do that? Or is this like, this is part of the system that we just need to redesign completely?
It's a great question. And a lot of very intelligent people have been putting a lot of thought into this for a long time. And actually the USAID specifically was one of the leading donor organizations in terms of localizing its aid. It was really pushing for a much higher percentage of that money to be given to local organizations before all of this happened. Ironically, it was getting more efficient, it was getting better. But that's, I think, the big thing: finding ways to get money to local organizations, making sure it's less restricted, so organizations can use it to do what actually is needed, rather than whatever has been agreed with somebody that's a long way away, and then according to a log frame that can't be changed over the course of often many years. Which in the old system meant that often things were being done that just didn't make any sense at a particular moment. The other piece of this, which I learned a long time ago working in Afghanistan, was trying to find ways to pool funding, so that donors are not working at cross purposes, that they're not all giving different amounts of money for the same work in the same places. So coordinating better and pooling resources in ways that can generate collective impact much more easily. There's conversations at the moment about this idea of country platforms, which is part of this. So how do we create platforms within specific countries that allow governments to coordinate with all of the donors to fund very specific priorities in ways that make sense? And then from our perspective, that also means bringing in civil society, making sure there's oversight, making sure there's accountability, making sure that citizens have a voice in the decision making and in the management of all of this. Because in the end, this is for them. It's about supporting people to have better lives and access services.
From the NGO's perspective, what are the takeaways? What are the conversations happening now about how to, I won't say prevent this from happening again, but ways that they can look at their organizations to ensure they're a little bit better balanced, or that they communicate their impact a little bit differently? Like, what are the things that they should be taking away from this time?
One big one that we touched on is sustainability financially. How do organizations sustain themselves going forwards if aid money from governments is just no longer going to be what it was? So there's a lot of conversation about earned income and revenue streams and how organizations might be able to think about that. As I said, I don't think that's possible for everyone, at least not in a way that would sustain all of what they do, possibly part of it. There are some things that are just political, they're not linear, they're longer term, that require some degree of philanthropic or government support. There are conversations, as I mentioned, about mergers and partnerships. How can organizations find synergies between what they do or consolidate bits of what they do? There's consolidation in the networks that exist. So how do we kind of find ways to coordinate and share lessons a bit more effectively? Organizations are also suffering currently from a double whammy. It's not just the reduction in aid money, it's also that their own governments are using this moment to close space and roll back progressive policies around all sorts of issues, LGBTQI rights, gender, all sorts of other things. So the space to operate is also getting more difficult. So a lot of organizations are taking security a lot more seriously, thinking through how they can better coordinate informally. And then at the same time, as you pointed out, the narrative piece, how do they better explain what they do in ways that will generate support?
So when you're working with these organizations, how are you helping them? Like, what are the questions or what are the things that they commonly need help with? I mean, I'm sure they're kind of like, we need money, and you're like, okay, everybody does. But like, what's the process that you guys have for helping them? And are there some common gaps that you are like, we can fill this one quickly, or this is the one strategically you need to be thinking about? Like, because I feel like there's a bit of both. You need to solve the short term and survive, but you need to also find ways to thrive and be sustainable. How are you working with these organizations now? And are there some like common areas that you find everyone's facing that you have easy answers for? And are there common areas that you see like there's just no answers right now?
And the first imperative, I think, at the moment is to survive. We all collectively need to get through this particular moment, and there's lots of parts of that. One big piece that we've been working with a lot of organizations is supporting organizations to share intelligence and ideas on how to respond to the US government cuts. As I mentioned, there's still a lot of issues to be worked out in response to those cuts in terms of justifying some costs that need to be reimbursed, some of those sort of more technical pieces to make sure that organizations can get the money that they are owed as part of these aid cancellations. So that's one step of surviving. We're talking to a lot of organizations currently about governance, how to make sure your boards can support you to make the right decisions, to be strategic, and obviously from a fiduciary standpoint are aware of the risks that are there at the moment. So then that leads into thinking about risks. Those are financial, of course. How do you build earned income streams? Also political risks, as we touched on. And then through the mergers and partnerships hub that we've created, we're talking to a lot of organizations about how to find partners, where to hand off pieces of their work, where there might be synergy organizationally to allow some of the assets and value and expertise to be preserved, whether that's in an independent organization or as part of another one, so that we have something to rebuild from once we work out what the new status quo is in terms of aid and civic and social work as a whole.
That leads kind of the two things I've been thinking a lot about, which is one, the world was already shifting away from aid, not just like the donors themselves, but also the receiving. Like India does not want foreign money coming in. Vietnam does not want foreign money coming in. China does not want foreign money coming in. And then also the idea of like resilience. I will admit, I was kind of stunned by how many organizations were so reliant and were so quickly requiring to cut staff. I won't say cut programs. Like I understand you got to shut down a program because you know the funny, but like really make hard cuts to an organization and threats to it. And I'm curious, like between those two things, yes, USAID kind of clipped the wings of a lot of groups, but you know, what's the future of these organizations? How should they look at their planning differently now so that they are more resilient?
It's really interesting to see the way that some organizations are able or willing to respond in this moment, and whether they, as I like to put it, take a microscope or a telescope to these issues. And it might be both in the short term that are needed. You know, we need to, as you just asked, look through the microscope at what to do right now to survive. But then we do need to, you know, to pan out and look at the bigger picture here. And I think for a lot of organizations that are not close to Washington, D.C., there's still a hope that maybe the money is going to come back, that maybe policies will change, that perhaps things will go back to some degree to the way they were. And I unfortunately don't think that's the case. Even if there's a new administration in the US in 4 years, I don't see this coming back in the same way. Someone yesterday was saying that it's a bit like pushing toothpaste out of a tube. Like in theory, after you've done it, you could try and put that toothpaste back in, but it's very difficult to do. And the same, I think, is going to be the same for the aid sector. Things will change, people move on, and I don't think this money is coming back. So we need to disabuse ourselves of the idea that somehow in the future things are going to be back as they were, and need to plan accordingly. We have to find different ways of working, and I think one big piece of it is definitely diversifying the funding base. If you're going to be funded by philanthropy or governments, we cannot be as reliant on one big donor, and that comes back to some of the things we talked about: individual giving, in particular, donor circles, mutual aid type models. Finding ways to do more with less is going to be central to everything that civil society has to do, unfortunately. And then maybe there's revenue models and other ways that can supplement that. But I think the key at this moment is not to pretend that we can go back. It has to be looking forwards and completely reimagining what we can do with the resources that are available, and then move on from there.
I agree. My question is whether Americans or Europeans will continue giving to other people right now, in part because some of what we're seeing is a direct reflection of the fact that, like, my own community needs to be served in America, in Europe. So why are you giving foreign money away? And I feel like that's kind of bled into the general population in terms of how they're giving as well. Are you seeing the same thing, or do you see, like, actually there's a reversal? Like, hey, wait a second, my government isn't doing it, so therefore I will. Like,
yeah, I mean, we don't do much work in the US itself on domestic issues, but particularly around issues of democracy and governance and human rights, there is clearly a shift in focus amongst some individuals and foundations towards US domestic issues for reasons that are probably quite clear to most people. Absolutely, Americans deserve better services. They deserve better governance, and the US government has the right to direct resources to those, as do American individuals. But looking at that in isolation I'm not sure, going to solve those problems. The world is hyper connected at this point, and so if there's a difficult conflict in another part of the world, that is going to have knock-on effects one way or another that affects the US. So a broader and longer-term view of this, I think, would indicate that international giving is still extremely important.
I don't know. In Southeast Asia, where I spend a lot more of my time, I've been talking a lot about people, don't count on it coming back. And I've been asking a really pointed question to government officials and to local NGOs, like, what happens if we don't come to save you? And I always say, like, if we, like the white people creating the green funds because we feel guilty, because we feel it's part of our moral obligation, because we feel it's part of our legacy, like, if that signaling goes away because of domestic issues and therefore the money goes, like, what will you do? And I don't know if that's a common question you're seeing being asked, but it's one that I've been thinking a lot about lately, because Southeast Asia actually has quite a bit of money. It has actually developed over the last 10, 15 years to where there's wealth being generated, a middle class being generated, brands have money. So it's almost easier to ask that question knowing that there's some answers locally that they just didn't tap into because they had another source for the time being. So I'm just kind of struggling to figure out, like, how do you help organizations the best navigate through that?
Kenya, for example, is an interesting case, because leadership in Kenya has said this is an opportunity for us actually to unshackle ourselves from the aid system, to make our own decisions, to have more autonomy in the way that we manage our economy and our developments, which in theory sounds good. The question is, how are they going to do that? And I think there is a real opportunity, and this is something that we at the Accountability Lab are looking at now, to focus on the domestic governance processes that would allow that to happen. So revenue generation, for example. If governments now need to fill gaps financially, they need to generate more revenue, they need to collect more taxes. There's a lot of inefficiencies in most places in that respect, that could be fixed. There's a big conversation around debt globally at the moment, as you know as well. Many developing countries are paying massive amounts of interest on debt. So there's questions around governance related to debt relief. So I think there are definitely ways that countries can use this to support their autonomy, their independence, to change their relationships with the global north. But that requires governance, and it requires leadership, and some changes that it's unclear currently are very feasible based on some of the dynamics politically and institutionally in different places. So we'll see. It's going to be a challenge, but it is potentially an opportunity for governments to get better at serving citizens, and for civil society organizations to monitor and support that.
And so as part of that, like for yourselves going forward, what's next for you in terms of this work that you've been doing, in terms of saying expanding the research or the understanding the nuance of the impacts, the tools that you're going to be developing? Like, how are you going to use this to maybe address some of these impacts?
So the big lesson that we learned from this data, as we talked about, is that organizations are not currently going to make it. They don't have the financial runways to survive. So there's going to have to be consolidation in the social sector. So we are really focusing on that mergers and partnerships piece. We've set up a hub, as I pointed out, that can help this happen. We've set up a shared fund and a pool of resources, technical resources, that can support organizations to merge or find partnerships. So I would encourage anyone listening that is interested in doing that for their own organization to be in touch with us. Maybe we can share the link for the form to send over data in the show notes. We're going to continue collecting the data on a periodic basis. As I mentioned, we're collecting more data now, which would be then a 3-month kind of retrospective. Where are we? Are things as bad as we thought they were, or are organizations finding other ways to sustain and survive? And if so, what are those? Because maybe there's lessons, in all of that. And all of this can then help support decision making. And then we're looking at some of the bigger infrastructure pieces, as I mentioned, revenue mobilization, debt. There's some interesting conversations happening now around governance-linked bonds and other mechanisms to kind of free up money for developing countries and ensure better accountability. And then also the private sector piece. A big part of the conversation, including this week at the World Bank spring meetings, is how to better crowd in the private sector for development. And that is clearly going to be a big part of the finance architecture going forwards. So how do we do that in a way that is fair, that's not overly extractive, that has the governance indicators and oversight built in? So all of that kind of stuff, from the very kind of big international policy type conversations all the way down to the very specific local organizational survival pieces, are connected, and I think need to be thought about coherently, and that's part of what I think we're in a position to do.
So with all that said, are you hopeful or are you fearful right now?
It's easy to be fearful, and this is a very difficult time for many people. But I do have hope. I think generally humans are resilient. I think civil society is very resilient. Many organizations have been dealing with crises for a long time in civil society of different sorts. So this is another difficult one, but I think there are really interesting ideas beginning to emerge about how to reshape the aid system, how to rethink development, and I'm hopeful that they will lead to something different in the future that can be better, and can lead to more secure, prosperous, inclusive societies.
So if you were to kind of take that and you're talking to a nonprofit, what are the 3 pieces of advice you give them to ensure it doesn't happen, that they're more resilient and they can have more impact over long term? Like, how should they be looking at their organization differently after the data you've seen, after what you've experienced yourself, to move forward, say for the next 3 to 5 years?
I think one general rule for all of us, which I would also suggest to any organization, is make sure you're in a position to be adaptive and flexible. none of us know what's coming. The way to deal with that is to make sure that you can learn in real time, that you can adapt as needed. That's the first one. The second, I think, would be learn how to create value for others, and for the field. I think the idea of continuing to just ask for money to do programs as you may have done previously is over. That's not going to work at this moment. We all have to work out how we can generate value of some kind. It doesn't need to be monetary. It could be data. It could be services of some kind, for others, because that's what's fundable. It's also what's helpful, at this moment. And then thirdly, I think it would be understand that this is not linear. It's one step forward, two steps back. We happen to be taking steps back currently, but there will be a path forwards. We just have to be resilient and move through that curve from survival to response, and then resilience over time. So what are the pieces that you need to put in place to be a resilient organization? That definitely relates to diversifying income streams. It relates to governance. It relates to operational systems. It relates to risk management. So there's chunks operationally, I think, that all organizations need to really think about currently. And if you have all of those pieces in place, generally, I think you should be able to survive, but it might be a bit of a rocky road.